As I said at the top of the show, we're going to talk about North Carolina's private school voucher program, which is known as the Opportunity Scholarship Program. Our first guest is going to help us walk through the law that created it and how it's being implemented today. She is Jane Wettach. She is the clinical professor of law, and the director of Children's Law Clinic at Duke Law School at Duke University. Thanks for being here, Jane.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's just start out. One of the things I wanted to do on the show today is I don't think a lot of our viewers and the public really knows a whole lot about this program, frankly. So can you help us understand sort of, how the program came about, sort of who's eligible,
Sure.
sort of how that initial program works?
Sure. So the program started about 3 years ago. It was passed by the legislature. And what it does is it provides a taxpayer-supported grant, also known as a voucher, to a student to assist with the tuition at a private school. So families can apply, and there are a number of vouchers that are available each year, and the amount is $4,200. It is the maximum voucher.
Per student per year.
Per student per year. So the eligibility requirements are tied to the free and reduced lunch limits of the federal program, although they're 133% of that. So right now it's about $60,000 for a family of 4 is the max income. So if your family has less than that, you're eligible to apply for your students to get a voucher. Right now we've had a few more people apply than there are vouchers available, so there's a lottery that is in place. Once a student gets a voucher though, then they're top priority to get a voucher for the remaining years. There's some other priority for the lower 3/4 of the income range, and there is some money set aside for entering first graders and kindergartners.
Right now, are there where can the scholarship be used? I mean, we mentioned these are private schools, but are
Sure.
there guidelines? I mean, a school just if they say sure we'll take it, are there any guidelines for those schools?
Well, any private school that is registered with the state of North Carolina can receive a voucher. They have to make certain commitments if they take voucher students. So primarily they have to do the things that private schools in North Carolina have to do, which are pretty limited. They have to keep attendance records, and they have to, normal private schools have to test their children at grades 3, 6, 9, and 11. A school that takes voucher students has to test the voucher students at all grades, starting at the 3rd grade. Now, none of that is public, so it's just that they have to test the students. They have to make the scores available to the parents.
Well, and that's one of the things I want to get into is to understand what the actually public and sort of visible requirements are. Now let's talk about the money a little bit.
Sure.
We're going to pull up on the screen first. I've got a chart that shows the sort of the appropriations that have over the first 5 years of the program. Talk to me about how this is growing and sort of where it's going.
Sure. So it started as a $10 million a year program, but the appropriation is anticipated to move up to $145 million a year in the next 10 years. So each year they're adding money, and there's authorized for an additional 2,000 students to get vouchers. So the anticipation is that it will grow to be $145 million a year and about 25,000 students.
So it started at $10 million a year and a half ago, 2 years ago basically, and then now we're talking about in 10 years' time, $145 million every year.
Yeah.
All right, now let's talk about, you mentioned these are private schools, but what kind of private schools? Right now so far, what have we seen in the first 2 full years of the program? Sure.
So the vast majority of vouchers are being used at religious schools, more than 90%.
Yeah, we've got another chart we're going to pull up, and please keep talking. This is the top 5 voucher schools and the amount of money we're talking about.
Right. So 90% of the vouchers, actually a little over 90%, have been used at religious schools. And remember, so they're private religious schools. They are not required to use any particular state-approved curriculum. They're not required to meet any state educational standards at all. So they're free, and most of the schools are Christian schools that can offer a biblical education if that's what they prefer.
And we're talking some significant dollars here. I mean, we obviously talk about public education a lot on this show. I mean, looking at the chart, we're talking about almost $1 million for each of the top 5 schools just in the last 2 years. I mean, this is and expected to grow exponentially.
Right. So it's pretty clear that some of the religious schools are being well supported by the voucher program.
Right. Now, talk to me. We've got a couple minutes left. I want to talk to me a little bit about this idea of transparency and sort of what we know and don't know
right.
in the program. That's one of critics of the program have said we don't really know what the schools are doing.
Sure, and so of course you know that public schools have to produce lots and lots of data about how their children are doing, but private schools don't. Now the law does require that schools that enroll more than 25 voucher students have to make public the aggregate test scores of their students. So this year, or actually we don't have them for this school year, but for the last school year there were 8 schools out of all the private schools that had to report their data. And all they do is report all their students together in an aggregate matter, how they scored on reading, language, and math, and they report out, again, all their students together, what percent scored above the 50th percentile as set by that test manufacturer
right.
and below the 50th percentile. So we don't know anything about grade levels or
right. So there's a,
race,
and
gender.
so there's not a lot of sort of oversight in terms of what kind of tests, what we report out. So
right.
we're going to get into that with our next 2 guests. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of the changes that we've seen in terms of the accountability for the program. But we appreciate you helping us get started here today, just understanding the sort of scope and who's involved in the program. So thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure.
All right, when we come back, we're going to continue our discussion of the Opportunity Scholarship Program. But first, as we go to break, see if you can answer this question. The Opportunity Scholarship Program is funded this school year total at $59.68 million. How much did last year's General Assembly budget project for annual funding by 2027?